If I had to give you one tool that changed everything, that changed everybody's life, it changed the way that you're experiencing and consuming this live stream, is the internet browser. This is the one thing that everyone has, everyone uses. People that have avoided technology, well, the first technology that they adopt when they finally jump on the technology train is the internet browser. I remember as a kid telling my parents all about how much I was in love. And my mom asked, "Who are you in love with?" And I told her the computer, but I really meant my internet browser because it opened up a whole new world for me. And little do we know, the browser's still doing that for us today, but with a whole new lens in mind. And I'm talking about enterprise browsers. So without further ado, run the intro.
Who says tech can't be human? Hello. I'm Jen Langdon, producer at Hacker Valley Media, and thank you for joining us today. The show is live, and with me, as always, I have your host and CEO, founder at Hacker Valley Media, Ron Eddings.
Glad to be back again. We have an amazing show planned, so buckle on in.
Ron, browsers, they've been around for a really long time. Why are we doing a show about browsers? Talk to me about that.
Let's talk about it. Browsers, like as I mentioned in my little intro, they've changed everything for us. And I think that we don't necessarily reflect on like the future of browsers enough. Like as we move further and further into the future, we get more and more reliant on the browser. So I thought it'd only be right to also share a little imagery of, kind of the evolution. When I first got addicted to the computer, I was using Netscape. Netscape was the browser, especially during the early mid 90s. And then as time went on, Internet Explorer started to gain popularity. And then time goes on even further. We get to the 2000s, and this is when things really started to heat up. Netscape is pretty much gone. We pretty much only see Internet Explorer until things like Firefox, Google Chrome come onto the scenes. Firefox kind of opened up the door for extending the browser and allowing a lot more customizations from a developer perspective and a user perspective. But then Chrome comes in and completely changes everything. Not only do they allow extensions, just like Firefox did, but they also allow you to write your own browser. And being able to write your own browser, it really opens up the door for any and everyone. It opens up the door for creators to create the perfect browser for them using Chromium. And also, it makes perfect space for our lovely sponsor, Island, who is creating an enterprise browser. And for those that don't know much about enterprise browsers, don't worry. We actually have a guest that's going to be joining us in just a few. But using an enterprise browser opens the door for a lot of things. I, as a security architect throughout my career, I've lent on so many different tools, so many different pillars. And one thing that you can trust and believe that all of your users have on their device is a browser. So think about all the possibilities from a user experience perspective, a security perspective, a productivity perspective. If you could manage the browser, that sounds absolutely amazing.
Ron, I'm sorry you ever used Netscape. That is awful to hear. Awful to hear. And my wedding photographer in 2012 having Netscape should have been a red flag. Ron, introduce us to our guest for today.
Yes, our guest for this episode is Bradon Rogers, Chief Customer Officer at Island. Welcome to the live stream, Bradon.
Hey, Ron and Jennifer. How are you guys doing?
Doing great.
Good. Ron, have you used an enterprise browser?
I have not used an enterprise browser. That's why we're here today. I'm excited to learn all about the capabilities. But what I will say, though, is if I was a security architect right now, as I have been throughout most of my career, I would be super excited about enterprise browser. My background and focus has been all about asset management. And asset management is a pain because you need to install an agent or try to use other API integrations to pull details about your endpoints. I would look at something like an enterprise browser. I'll definitely check out Island to see like, hey, can this help me with my asset management challenges? How does that? Is that typically an entry point for security practitioners that you hear, Bradon?
Well, certainly. First of all, thank you for having me. I think that's a really honor to be here with you. I think first of all, I think it's important to consider that there's a variety of different assets people use to access the key resources that they're to do their jobs. Some people prefer the traditional form factor. Some people prefer a Windows platform. Some people prefer a Mac. Some people prefer the mobile platform. So certainly, I think an important part of a browser is its ubiquity across those environments. And I think again, an important part of this is the fact that users have been trained to use browser. You hit on this a moment ago. I don't know how many years either one of you have been trained to use a web browser, but I think since the day I started using the internet, the first app, as you called out, was to use the browser. So
absolutely,
pervasive appeal that it has across those platforms is important. Certainly, its ability to not only live in those environments is important without training. But now you think about, as we think about an enterprise browser, its ability to drive context to understand the environment it's operating in. So you start thinking about asset management, you start thinking about the assets people use to help an org gain insight and understanding in the types of devices that are being used, the state of those devices as they're being used. Are they living up to the corporate standard we want them to adhere to, especially if it's a third-party device? If we're going to use a third-party device, do they have the appropriate endpoint controls? Do they have full disk encryption? Do they have, is it patched to the appropriate degree? So understanding the state of the assets that are accessing our key resources and using that state of those resources is an important set of context that the browser drives. And it certainly can give telemetry to the org and as you fill out things in your data aggregation environments, your Snowflake and your Splunks and your Exabeams and things like that. That conclude an immense amount of data about the assets that are being used in the environment as well.
How would you describe or define enterprise browsers in 2 sentences or less?
Wow. 2 sentences or less. That's always hard. What's the old Mark Twain quote?
Yep.
I didn't have enough time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. I would say the browser's where the user's eyes, where they spend their time every single day. And the fact is, we never built a browser that was cooperative with the enterprise. And the enterprise browser is that first natural experience that we can use as a foundational vehicle to deliver applications to our end users in a safe way.
I could imagine that there's a lot of risks that it could feel like one would be taking creating a browser, because there are things like Chrome extensions. And when I first learned about like the enterprise browser space, there's some players that do the Chrome extension, then other players that do the full-on browser like yourselves. What was I kind of like the reason behind that, and what did the customer say? You speak to a lot of customers. What's been the perspective of extension versus browser?
Well, first of all, if you think about the genesis of the enterprise browser, you think there's many things that have failed in the past that were attempts to drive a different form of browser that was relevant for the enterprise. We called them secure browsers in the past. There were things in the early 2000s that would put virtualization wrappers around those browsing experiences. And the philosophy of those technologies was all about, hey, look, this browser is apt to do something that we don't want in our environment. Download malware, engage malicious destination, whatever it may be. Let's wrap it with something and let's keep it from doing those stupid things it should do. And unfortunately, what happened in that experience was we as an industry, we built technologies that were unusable by the end users. The user experience was atrocious. So fast forward many years, the idea that, look, the users spend all of their time, their eyes are married to that browser, which is where the audience is engaging. The tip of the spear happens there, right? And we said, look, because that has such a familiar experience and it's very ubiquitous across users, whether technical or not, what if we rethought the browser a bit But instead of the context of the consumer, think of the context of the enterprise, and that's exactly what we did. We built a browser for the enterprise. Now, you asked a very relevant question in there. There's been different form factors of how we can wrap things around the browser. Sometimes some orgs have used extensions, and extensions have their place in the environment. Oftentimes extensions from various application providers and others can add user productivity. They can add security elements, from some vendors. They can also add organizational productivity around certain applications as well, if they have their place. And so there's one thing is leveraging the browser to govern the usage of certain extensions, third-party extensions. There's also the vehicle in the enterprise browser space of using an extension as that vehicle as well. And they both have their place. There's some things extensions can't do. They can't do very effectively. For example, on a third-party device, enforcing an extension on a third-party device that you don't manage and you don't own. It's hard to make users use the extension, number one. But number two, really, the extension has a hard time really protecting the actual browser. Think about the cookies and the cache in your existing consumer browser. It's hard to use an extension to protect the cookies and cache. So there are mechanics of a full-on browser experience that are quite important in creating that safe experience. And there's value in the managed real estate for extensions, by which we provide both form factors as well. We view an extension as just yet another form factor of what we do at Island as well.
Love that. When you look at the browser as a whole, what has been your history to it? I shared mine. How did we get here today where the enterprise is now accepting, yep, this is a great idea. We do need an enterprise browser.
Well, as you can detect, my gray head of hair here, I'll probably give away the fact I've been doing this for a long time. I think it's important to think about where we started as an industry. And there was a point in time where, you think about why the browser exists today. At its core, the browsers we all used, and that diagram showed the beautiful graphic earlier on. But you notice that universe, every one of those browsers that were popping up, they were focused on the consumer experience. And that's fine. And those browsers, the way those vendors make their money in creating those browsers is often around shopping. At its core, the targeted advertising universe, right? And the issue is the people that made those browsers, their mission's not aligned with the practitioner's mission. Practitioner's mission is to protect the resources we hold dear. So that's forced our hands. We stand up an immense amount of infrastructure around that experience. Sometimes we stand up things like proxies and DLP, and CASB, and remote browser isolation and mobile device management. Just keep going down that endless list. And even we've done this thing of shifting the deck chairs a bit, and we call it Secure Service Edge now. We got clever. We moved it all to the cloud, but we use those same deck chairs in a lot of ways, but we do it in the cloud. But because that browser doesn't cooperate, it wasn't a part of our architecture. We had to do those things. And it's not to say we wouldn't want some of those things in the appropriate degree, but building the mechanics natively into the browser kind of gives us a different advantage, gives us a unique opportunity to protect. So that's just what we did at Island. We started building a browser where we meet the practitioner at the tip of the spear where the user engages. The browser window is truly the place where the user engagement happens and the practitioner, they meet right there in that little, right there in that, I'll call it market space, whatever it is. It's that hub where they meet. And at that point, the ability for us to deliver services natively, then follow the user anywhere they go with policy natively built into the browser, not backhauling traffic back through clouds, and having to build POPs all over the world, worrying about data privacy laws everywhere, that we go, literally driving the policy and the application engagement right there in the browser window and using the mechanics of the browser to be that proverbial tip of the spear where all of these things come together. That's been a really, really marvelous thing. Now, something you hit a moment ago, and I'll stop. But when we first did this, there were people that were out of the gate. Wait, you built a browser? Wait a minute, hold on. You built a browser? And that is the most fun part of showing Island off to our customers. Is the first time people see it. When they have that initial reaction, it's going to be a fun meeting, because I often show them right out of the gate something that's very familiar to the end user. The user doesn't have to be trained. It looks just like the browser they already know, very well from 20 years. But on the back end, one of the most powerful platforms that the practitioner can have in their arsenal. And we show them unique things they've never been able to do before, leveraging that footprint, because living at that true last mile, that presentation layer, gives us unique governance that is unlike any other technology.
By the way, I wanted to kind of like jump into another piece about the browser that I think is going to be kind of insightful for many people that haven't used an enterprise browser is, use cases. I'm sure there's a lot of security use cases. My background security, a lot of our audience that's tuning in, they're security practitioners, but I would also imagine that there's other positive things besides just security use cases. So maybe you could share too, like share one really awesome use case for enterprise browsers when it comes to security, and then also one that maybe people don't expect but are pleasantly delighted by.
Yeah, Rod, I think that's probably the most fun part of the job I get to do every single day. So I get to scratch the itch of the cyber practitioners with really cool things they've never seen before. What's really fun is when you think of things we've historically had to do to drive agreement between the audience of cyber and these people that have to deliver apps and services to the people that do their jobs every day, the knowledge workers. Oftentimes we have to come up with these least common denominators we can all agree upon, right? That's why we wound up with VDI as an example, virtual desktop infrastructure, because the applications teams could agree that this was something that could be used for delivering apps, and they put them in the hands of the audiences. And the practitioners could go, you know what, we can agree with the appropriate degree of risk that brings to our organization. And so they both agree on it. The challenge was the end user pays the tax in that process. So the tax and the user experience in general, but practitioners pay all kinds of taxes as well from a cost standpoint, from the managing infrastructure, et cetera. And so I think what's really fun about this is the immense power of the enterprise browser to solve extensive use cases that meet the needs of both cyber as well as those practitioners. Sometimes, I mentioned a few examples of that. One really fun one that we've done a number of is, it's around service resilience. When an organization goes through an incident, what's the first thing the practitioners tell the rest of the org to do when you go through a significant incident? Close your laptop. Don't connect to anything. Like, we don't know the scope of everything that's happening. And we inadvertently sever communication in the organization. Mm-hmm. I'll be honest with you. If you think about it, there's a lot of people that I've worked with over my years that I don't have their contact info in my phone because I talk to them over Slack and Zoom and Teams and things like that. That's how I get them. And then suddenly those services are severed. So for us, a great use case has been around the service access resilience, where during an incident, we have to shut down these resources and shut laptop lids, but let's let users go home, download the Island browser. Now they're arm's length from the organization. They're no longer domain joined. We can then let the user download a browser at home, present the applications necessary for communication or the core parts of their job, and get them back to work literally in the matter of minutes. Again, for the key apps they need in the performance of their duties. We've had several wonderful, situations where orgs have found value in that, having gone through those. And that's a really kind of, again, that was a use case we imagined early on. It's starting to see the light of day in several organizations over the past year or so. And but again, I think this is one fun part of the browser is we use these core mechanics to solve just this immense amount of use cases that are truly endless at the end of the day.
I need to jump in for a second to ask a question from our sponsor for this episode, Island. What application do enterprises use most? It's not Salesforce. It's not Office 365. It's actually the browser. Yet the browser isn't even an enterprise application, which is why organizations are forced to surround a huge stack of security and IT tools just to get the browser to cooperate with their enterprise organization. It's not the browser's fault. It just wasn't designed for the enterprise. But what if it was? That's where Island, the enterprise browser, comes into play and is here to help. Island builds core security, IT, and productivity needs for your organization into the browser itself. Their enterprise browser creates the ideal workspace where everything you need for work is built in and everything else is out of the way. Hundreds of leading enterprise organizations, including global hotel chains, airlines, banks, hospitals, and retail giants, are using Island right now to reimagine the way they secure and enable work. Visit island.io to learn more. Island, work's natural next step. Thank you, Island, for sponsoring this episode. So I love everything that you're describing about the use cases. I would imagine that once you get your hands on this type of technology, you almost start to think about more and more of the possibilities. right now we live in this era of co-pilots. Like everybody's talking about AI. I'm sure that you all have built a little bit of AI in your technology. One of the things that I've heard from many different security companies that are trying to do AI in their products is they're trying to almost provide like some type of co-pilot feel. Like if someone's not doing the right thing, there's that layer of governance on top saying, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Before you go to things like ChatGPT, are you sure you want to paste in this block of clipboard that looks like source code? Tell me a little bit about, that piece, because I'm sure that's a great benefit for IT administrators, CIOs, CISOs, that layer of governance that you can add on top. What do you typically see people want to restrict their users from doing or guide them into making better considerations?
Well, if you think about the adoption of these new generative AI technologies, they usually fall into a handful of form factors. The most pervasive is a browser-oriented form factor. Sometimes they're extension-based form factors. You think of a lot of different technologies that are leveraging AI to assert themselves, things that can give you, for example, feedback on your grammar and your usage of your applications. And then there's the API frameworks that, where you build your own applications and services that tie into something. Two of the form factors that are the most pervasive fell right into our wheelhouse right out of the gate. I think it's an important thing to highlight that as these things exploded onto the scene, the response from many organizations had to be, they had no choice in many cases, to immediately try to put services or techniques in place to block the end users from access, because we wanted to make sure we were using these things responsibly in our organizations. And you've seen news stories of orgs inadvertently users using things to try to make their job better, and sensitive materials winding up in the wrong places. It's a natural thing for the end users. And a natural element of what we do inside of Island, number one, is helping the org as they adopt the right sanction services to shepherd the user very cleanly to the right place. So say you're going to something like ChatGPT and the org has an alternative path they want you to follow. Rather than just putting a block in place, maybe we shepherd the user to the appropriate destination. Second part of that might be, let's let them use ChatGPT, but let's go through an approval workflow where you send it through a ServiceNow ticket, and naturally built in the mechanics of what we do is the approval workflow, where we can automate approvals and automate policy creation and dynamically expire policies, so that the user, maybe we give them temporary access to something like ChatGPT for research or exploration work. By the way, while keeping the data safely bound where it belongs, keeping data from spilling over into applications like that. So we can recognize corporate apps from other types of apps and say, you know what, I want to let users use corporate apps, let them use personal, but not risk data spilling over. And then there's the third element is, not only shepherding the users to the appropriate sanction areas, but even within the world of Island for orgs that haven't made those decisions, to build mechanics into our browser, leveraging something called Island AI Assistant, just naturally built into the browser, for giving a user another alternative as well, that gives them an outlet that can be contextually trained on the organization's context. Because again, the one thing that's important is the enterprise browser is always context oriented. It's always aware of the context it's operating in, who the user is, their group memberships, the device they're on, their geolocation, all these contextual clues. So that context can drive the engagement with generative AI to give answers that are very appropriate related to the org, and even to tie into organizations' content repositories, via techniques like RAG, where I can tie into the existing repository of content so we can train that. But shepherding the user and giving them a clean experience in the interface to where they can access it, readily access it at the right time, but do so safely is a really important part of what we do. By the way, always over the experience is the ability to layer data protection techniques over that, whether you've invested in your own DLP technologies or you want to leverage the ones that we've built in Island. But keeping the data safely, bound where it belongs is a really important part of that, to do it responsibly.
What kinds of tools can be replaced, consolidated with something like this?
Yeah, man, reduction is first of all, it's something very important in every org. Nobody has the ability, orgs don't have the ability to spend endlessly on the next thing and the next thing without trying to retire something else or at least reduce it. I've worked with many, many technologies. After every piece of technology in cyber, almost, it feels like I've touched in my career. This is one of those that has the opportunity to reduce the dependency on so many things. And it all depends on your usage of those things as well. So, mileage may vary, but I often find, number one is that VDI infrastructure. So those things like Citrix and VMware Horizon and desktop as a service, and the users don't always love those experiences I talked about before.
Mhm.
That's a great opportunity in a lot of organizations. We've done substantial VDI reductions. VPN, built into the browsers, these private access mechanics that allow seamless access to internal applications without the need for a VPN client. So if VPN infrastructure is a part of that equation, there you go. Other things like proxies, we got safe browsing built in the browser, categorization, things like that. DLP, I mentioned a little while ago. CASB technologies for protecting the cloud apps and services. Mobile device management, we're using it for posture assessment and things along those lines. Remote browser isolation, where you're wrapping that browsing experience for this little 1% of traffic that you're concerned about. You've got mechanics built into the browser for those things. In fact, I think it's a really fun part of our genealogy at Island that our co-founder is one of the inventors of remote browser isolation. They founded a company on that many years ago. So the opportunities are far and wide. And by the way, in many of those areas, if the org likes those things, if they've invested deeply in, let's say, a Microsoft Purview strategy for DLP, we integrate those things. We tie into those and we leverage that existing investment. So if you've got single sign-on or your SIEM infrastructure or your DLP infrastructure, your malware inspection with something like CrowdStrike, they're a great partner. But be able to tie into what your existing investment is an important part of that. We take that existing investment and extend that into places you couldn't reach into before. And that place is, for example, the unmanaged assets where you can't get agents in place. You BYOD resources and things along those lines. So extending what your investment is in those places is very powerful as well.
How would you recommend IT and security teams to play nicely when it comes to a tool like this? Because I can imagine that both teams would be like, hey, I'm going to manage this tool, this solution. And another team might also want the stake because they want to have their say in how it's deployed, how it's monitored, how it's managed. How would you recommend people to collaborate on, using this type of technology?
Well, I think certainly in an early engagement, bringing their peers into the discussion, that's always very helpful. And the one nice thing about Island is, like any good technology should have, is role-based access control, role-based, processes and technological capabilities, so that each side can, scratch their itch at the appropriate time. So I think that is a really important foundational part of what we do that allows both sides to drive something to scratch their intellectual itch. But the other side is, and again, I think one org, may be empowered to do more than the other org, but at the end of the day, I think I call it the least common denominator factor. That is really, really fun when we're working with these technologies, because when one team's seen it first and they get excited about showing the other team, rarely I have had a piece of technology where a cyber team gets excited to go, I got to go show the CTO, or I've got to get our CIO to see this, or I've got to get this applications team to see it. They're eager to go bring those people in. They jokingly argue over who's going to get it, but at the end of the day, they're eager to bring the others into it.
Yep.
And that is fun, because I just never experienced that in my prior cyber worlds. I never had the CISO take me over to the CTO or whatever. They took me down to their teams, and that's where we stay for the most part.
And what is, maybe 1, 2, 3 pieces that organizations really appreciate about the audit perspective?
I think the complementary nature of what it is, it's not in substitution. It's not going to be a big overlap of the things you're already aggregating. It's great that you get data from your firewall and your proxy. A lot of times they're providing a lot of the same data. So that's just doubling the storage of the things that you have. For my universe, it is entirely a different dimension of data.
So what are some of those artifacts? Like, I would imagine, like, you could probably pull the host name, IP address.
Sure.
What are the type of things?
Well, let's get some basics. The screenshot of what the user was engaging. What about where they click their mouse on the screen? What about the keystroke of what the user engaged in a privileged area of an application? We reserve that for privileged areas for a variety of reasons, but those are some examples. But truly living at the present. By the way, one little side note on this whole thing is, I don't have to tamper with SSL to get that visibility.
Right.
So being a natural termination for SSL is really nice, because unlike upstream techniques where I have to break the SSL, do the certificate swaps and all the other stuff, and create that new trust in the environment so we get visibility. I'm doing that on the other end of the SSL termination, so I have unimpeded visibility. So from a practitioner standpoint, the deployment side of the house, gone are the days of having to do all that break and inspect stuff that everybody hates in the first place.
In the past, I've worked at organizations where we have used the managed functionality of the Chrome browser, and it was helpful. It allowed us to prevent Chrome extensions from being installed, but I'm not sure if it really enabled a lot more, especially from this audit perspective of being able to pull that level of information. And you were also mentioning data spillage, data spilling over to personal. Uh, I'm curious, how does that work? How does the browser stop you from sharing, like taking a file from our corporate Google Drive and putting it on your personal Google Drive?
Great. Great question. So the browser being application aware, and by the way, tenant aware as well is a really important part of this. So it can discern the differences between different tenants of a given service. So that's important. Like, think about mergers and acquisitions. You acquire another org, both sides have their own Office 365 environment. You may want to apply a different policy to one environment than you do to the other, possibly. Different level of audit, maybe as well in the process. So, but an important part I mentioned earlier is building this boundary around those application engagements. So an understanding of the applications alone is a foundationally important thing that's different, that an enterprise browser can deliver. And for me, when I stand up policies around that application boundary alone, that like I mentioned earlier, that changes the game dramatically, because now the focus is no longer around the disparate, unstructured data. It's around the app that contains the data in the first place. So that alone, that kind of starts the conversation into the right place. Again, back to the question from a data protection standpoint. The best part about that is that doesn't just apply to things like copy and paste, but file movements. The browser can be tied into your existing storage. We're going to leverage your G Drive and your OneDrive and things like that. So when the user tries to engage a file in their personal Gmail, we'll make corporate OneDrive available. But when they try to engage a file, or make it unavailable, I should say, when they try to engage corporate G Suite, game on. You can engage corporate OneDrive, corporate G Suite, whatever, and pull the file and put it in the corporate application that you think is appropriate. But the browser's ability to universally across its capabilities to respect the application is super important. Now, we built a lot of mechanics to make those things possible. Things like your own clipboard in your OS. Your clipboard in your OS has one storage buffer for one item. The ability to do multi-copy and paste buffer, but have it respect the application boundary so that you go to personal apps, the appropriate things on the clipboard aren't available anymore. And these are things that existing in prior technologies just didn't do. So you called out a few of those over the discussion here. They just didn't have this level of dexterity. And I think that's probably, if I had one word to apply to what we do in general, it is dexterity, because it's the dexterity to solve an immense number of use cases. It's dexterity of technological approaches within. It's dexterity to be able to meet the needs of different levels of different types of practitioners. It probably has the most dexterity of any technology I've worked with.
Well, we want to send our thanks again to Island for sponsoring this live stream today. And be sure to check out their website to learn more. And thanks again, Bradon, for having you on. Great guest, so knowledgeable, and really appreciate you sharing your insight with us today.
Well, hey, Ron, Jennifer, thank you so much. I really appreciate the dialogue. That was a fun session.
Bradon, thank you so much. I'm super jazzed about enterprise browsers even more. I've always been so excited about the opportunity that it can open up for IT and security. And I gotta say, we speak to every single company that comes on and sponsors. I would highly recommend checking out Island. Thanks to them again. Also, thank you to our lovely audience. Thank you for tuning in with us. We would love to see you back on the live stream. And with that, we will see everyone next time.